My name is Hannah Miller. I'm in my mid-30s now, old enough to see patterns clearly, young enough to still remember how they felt when they first formed. I've lived most of my life in plain sight, present, dependable, and quietly useful. The kind of person people don't worry about, the kind they assume will always be fine. If you asked my family who I was growing up, they would have said I was the steady one, not the talented one, not the difficult one, not the one with big needs or loud dreams. I was the one who adjusted, the one who waited, the one who could be relied on when things went wrong, because things always went wrong for someone else first. To the outside world, I probably looked lucky, safe, uncomplicated. I wasn't ignored in obvious ways. I wasn't abused or abandoned. I was included, just never prioritized, remembered, just never chosen first. I was the backup plan in my own family, and for a long time, I didn't even know there was another role available. This story isn't about revenge. It's not about exposing anyone or proving who was right or wrong. There are no villains here, at least not the kind you can point to easily. What I'm sharing is quieter than that. It's about what happens when you are consistently underestimated and how that shapes the way you move through the world. Over the next hour, I'm going to walk you through a period of my life when I slowly realized I was only remembered when others failed, when plans fell apart, when someone else couldn't handle the pressure. I'll tell you how that realization didn't arrive all at once, but in small moments, missed glances, delayed calls, assumptions made on my behalf. You'll hear about the role I was assigned without ever agreeing to it, how I stayed silent longer than I should have, not because I was weak, but because I believed silence was maturity, responsibility, love. And then, quietly, something shifted. Not a confrontation, not a dramatic exit, just a change in how I listened, how I prepared, how I stopped explaining myself to people who weren't truly listening anyway. What follows is not a story of sudden success or poetic justice. There were no miracles, no lottery moments, no public apologies. What happened instead was subtler and irreversible, a psychological reversal that no one noticed until it was already complete. I'm telling this story honestly, without exaggeration, because I know how common this position is. Many of us grow up learning how to be useful before we learn how to be valued. We learn to be the safety net, the fallback, the reliable option when the preferred one disappears. If any part of this resonates with you already, I invite you to stay, not for drama, but for clarity. Before we begin, let me ask you something gently and without judgment. Have you ever realized that people only looked for you when their first choice didn't work out? For most of my life, I didn't think of myself as overlooked. That word felt too dramatic, too emotional. I believed I was simply low maintenance, easy, adaptable. I wore those traits like quiet badges of honor. In my family, those qualities were praised, just never rewarded. I was the middle child, which already placed me in a strange position. Not the first miracle, not the last surprise. I arrived after expectations were set and before patience ran out. From early on, I learned how to read a room before speaking, how to sense when now wasn't the right time to ask for something, how to shrink a want into something reasonable, then shrink it again just to be safe. My siblings had labels. One was the talented one, whose potential everyone spoke about as if it were a fragile investment. The other was the sensitive one, whose emotions required constant attention and accommodation. I was simply reliable. The word followed me everywhere, said with a smile that implied completeness, as if nothing more needed to be added. If a problem came up, I was called last, but trusted most. If plans fell apart, I was the one expected to understand. When someone needed help moving, covering a shift, or smoothing over an awkward situation, I was the obvious choice. Not because I wanted to be, because I didn't protest. At family gatherings, no one worried about whether I was having a good time. They assumed I was. I listened more than I spoke. I laughed at the right moments. When conversations turned competitive or tense, I quietly excused myself to refill drinks or check on food. People noticed my absence only when something practical was missing. I don't say this with bitterness. Back then, it didn't feel like neglect. It felt like trust. I told myself I didn't need the same attention because I was stronger, that I didn't mind being flexible, that love didn't have to be loud to be real. These beliefs weren't forced on me. They grew naturally in the gaps where affirmation could have been. When decisions were made, big ones like holidays or finances, and small ones like where to eat or who needed help, my opinion was often sought after everything else had been decided. "You're okay with this, right?" they'd ask. And I usually was. Or at least I convinced myself I was. There's a specific kind of invisibility that doesn't hurt at first. It feels like peace. No conflict, no drama, no pressure to perform. But over time, it creates a quiet erosion. You begin to feel like your presence only matters in relation to other people's needs. I was remembered, just not anticipated. If someone canceled, I was called. If someone failed, I was asked to step in. If someone didn't show up emotionally, I was expected to compensate. I didn't resent it because I didn't yet recognize it as a pattern. Patterns are hard to see when you're standing inside them. What no one seemed to notice was that I had my own internal life, one that didn't revolve around being helpful. I had preferences I never voiced because no one asked directly. I had ambitions that felt inappropriate to share because they didn't come with urgency or drama. I had boundaries, but they were untested, so they remained theoretical. In photos, I'm often on the edge of the frame, leaning slightly inward, smiling but not centered. At the time, I thought that was just how pictures worked. Looking back now, I understand something I couldn't articulate then. I wasn't unseen because I lacked value. I was unseen because I made it easy. And when you make it easy for people to underestimate how much you matter, they usually will. This wasn't cruelty. It was convenient. And convenience, I would later learn, is one of the most powerful forces in family systems. At this stage of my life, I still believed my role was neutral, maybe even noble. I thought being the backup plan meant being trusted. I didn't yet understand what it costs to always be the one who can wait. That understanding came later, quietly, one small moment at a time. The first moment that stayed with me wasn't loud. It didn't come with raised voices or slammed doors. In fact, if I told it to someone else at the time, they probably would have shrugged and said I was reading too much into it. That's why it mattered. It happened on an ordinary weekday evening. Nothing symbolic, no holiday, no argument leading up to it. Just a phone call that came later than expected, with a tone that assumed I'd understand before anything was explained. My mother told me plans had changed. There was a family decision, already made. I'd been included in spirit, she said, but not in practice. Someone else had needed more consideration. Someone else's schedule was tighter. Mine, as usual, was flexible. I remember standing in my kitchen, phone pressed to my ear, staring at nothing in particular. I said okay, automatically. The word came out smoothly without resistance. I even added, "That makes sense," because it usually did. But after the call ended, I didn't move right away. There was a faint discomfort in my chest. Not anger, not sadness, just a pause. A hesitation where acceptance usually lived. I replayed the conversation in my head, not looking for offense, just trying to understand why it felt different. It wasn't the change itself. It was the assumption. No one had asked me first. No one had checked whether the new plan affected me. The decision wasn't malicious. It was efficient. I was the variable that could be adjusted without consequence. Later that night, the family group chat was filled with messages, jokes, updates, logistics. Everyone else responded quickly with enthusiasm or mild complaints. I watched the notifications stack up without adding anything. No one noticed my silence. The next day, I mentioned the change casually to a friend at work. I framed it lightly, almost humorously. She laughed and said, "Well, at least they know you're easygoing." Easygoing. That word again. Said like a compliment, heard like a dismissal. I nodded and changed the subject, but something inside me filed the moment away. Not as evidence, not as a grievance, just as data. From the outside, nothing had shifted. I still showed up, still helped, still responded quickly when needed. But internally, a small line had been crossed. For the first time, I noticed how often decisions were made around me instead of with me. And once you notice something like that, you start seeing it everywhere. I remembered other moments I'd dismissed, being informed instead of consulted, being thanked instead of being considered, being praised for understanding instead of being included. Each instance, on its own, was harmless. Together, they formed a pattern that was harder to ignore. What struck me most wasn't that anyone had intended to hurt me. It was that my feelings weren't part of the equation at all. Not because they didn't care, but because they didn't think they needed to. That night, I wrote a single sentence in the notebook I'd been carrying for years. I didn't decorate it. I didn't analyze it. I just wrote it down and closed the book. I am the easiest to adjust. At the time, I didn't know why I needed to record it. I just knew I didn't want to forget how it felt. Not the event, but the realization. From then on, when something similar happened, I noticed how quickly I was expected to adapt, how often my adaptability was used as justification. Hannah won't mind. Hannah understands. Hannah can handle it. I could. I always had. That was never the question. The question, which I still wasn't ready to ask out loud, was why I was the only one who had to. This wasn't the moment I changed. It was the moment I began paying attention. And attention, I would later learn, is the beginning of every quiet shift. After that first small cut, nothing dramatic followed. No confrontation, no apology. Life continued exactly as it had before, which in some ways was more unsettling than if something obvious had gone wrong. Because when nothing changes, you start questioning yourself. I told myself I was being overly sensitive, that families make decisions quickly, that someone always has to be flexible, and it might as well be the person most capable of handling it. I reminded myself that I was lucky, lucky to be trusted, lucky to be needed, lucky to not be high maintenance. That word again. I had built so much of my identity around not being it. The dismissals continued, but they were subtle enough to blend into routine. Invitations that arrived late, after plans were already half formed. Conversations that paused when I entered the room, then resumed without looping me in. Decisions that were explained to me instead of discussed. Each time, I adapted. Each time, I told myself it didn't matter. There was a strange comfort in that normalization. When something happens repeatedly, it stops feeling personal and starts feeling structural, as if it's simply the way things are. And structures feel harder to challenge than individual moments. I became skilled at filling in gaps. If someone forgot to tell me something, I figured it out. If I wasn't included in a discussion, I asked follow-up questions later. If my absence from a decision created inconvenience, I absorbed it quietly. I smoothed edges before anyone else even noticed they were sharp. In doing so, I unknowingly trained everyone around me. I trained them to expect my compliance, to rely on my silence as confirmation, to interpret my lack of protest as agreement. Over time, my consent became assumed instead of requested. The most difficult part wasn't that I was being overlooked. It was that I was participating in my own erasure, not intentionally, not consciously, but through repetition. There were moments when I considered speaking up, small openings in conversation where I could have said, "Actually, that doesn't work for me," or "I wish I'd been asked earlier." Each time, I stopped myself. I didn't want to seem dramatic. I didn't want to disrupt the flow. I didn't want to be perceived as difficult now, after years of being easy. So I swallowed the impulse and told myself I was choosing peace. But peace, I began to realize, can be a misleading word. Sometimes it means harmony. Other times, it means avoidance. The more I avoided, the more invisible my preferences became, not just to others, but to me. I stopped checking in with myself before responding. My default answer was, whatever works. I said it so often it began to feel true. At family events, I watched dynamics play out with new awareness. I saw how urgency was rewarded, how emotion created gravity, how the loudest need reshaped the room. I noticed how my calmness made me easy to sidestep. No one was trying to hurt me. That's what made it complicated. If there had been cruelty, I could have justified anger. If there had been neglect, I could have demanded attention. But there was only convenience and my willingness to accommodate it. Once, during a particularly busy period at work, I told my sister I couldn't help with something she'd assumed I would handle. It was the first time I'd said no without an apology attached. The silence on the other end of the line was brief, but telling. "Oh," she said, "I just thought you'd be free." Free, as if my time existed in a holding pattern, waiting to be claimed. I ended up helping anyway, just later than planned. I told myself it was because I wanted to, not because I felt pressured. The distinction was becoming harder to make. At night, I started writing more in my notebook. No complaints, observations. I tracked how often I was informed versus consulted, how frequently my needs were assumed to be minimal, how rarely anyone checked in with me unless something had gone wrong elsewhere. I didn't feel angry. I felt tired in a way that sleep didn't fix. What I didn't yet understand was that by normalizing these small dismissals, I was slowly teaching myself a dangerous lesson, that my role was to adapt, not to be considered. And once a role like that is established, it becomes very difficult to step out of it without consequences. Still, I stayed quiet. I told myself silence was maturity, that patience would eventually be recognized, that consistency would be rewarded. I believed that because I needed to. But normalization has a cost, and I was about to learn exactly what it was. There's a moment when a pattern stops feeling abstract and starts feeling assigned, not announced, not discussed, just understood. For me, that moment came not through conflict, but through clarity. I began to see my role the way others did. In my family, I was the one who filled gaps. If something was missing, I became it. If something failed, I replaced it. I wasn't the first option, but I was the safest one. The dependable answer when uncertainty made everyone else uncomfortable. They didn't rely on me because they believed in me. They relied on me because I reduced risk. That distinction mattered. When plans were being made, my presence was optional. When plans unraveled, my presence became essential. I was the insurance policy, quiet, uncomplaining, and always available when things didn't go as expected. I started noticing how language shifted around me, not in tone, but in implication. "Can you just handle this? You're good at this kind of thing. It's easier if you do it." These phrases sounded complimentary on the surface, but they carried an unspoken assumption that my role was functional, not participatory. I wasn't there to shape outcomes. I was there to stabilize them. At first, I thought this was a natural result of personality differences. I was organized, calm, capable. Of course, I would end up managing logistics and smoothing transitions. But over time, it became clear that competence was being used to justify exclusion. Because if I were always capable of adapting, why bother adapting for me? There was a family meeting, one of those informal ones that happen in kitchens and living rooms, without agendas or clear beginnings. A decision had already been made before I arrived. I was briefed quickly and efficiently, as if catching me up were a formality. Someone said, "You're okay with this, right?" While already moving on to the next topic. I said yes. Again, but inside, something clicked into place. I realized I wasn't being asked because my agreement was needed. I was being asked because my lack of resistance was expected. That was the role. Agreeable, useful, invisible. Once I named it internally, I couldn't unsee it. I noticed how my contributions were framed as support, never leadership, how my successes were treated as maintenance rather than achievement, how my presence was comforting but rarely celebrated. I wasn't invited into discussions about the future. I was included in the execution. And the most unsettling part was that I had helped build this dynamic by always stepping in, by never stepping back, by confusing being needed with being valued. I didn't blame my family. Roles like these form slowly, reinforced by small choices on all sides. They were responding to the version of me I had consistently presented, the one who didn't ask for much, didn't push back, didn't require recalibration. Still, recognizing the role didn't immediately free me from it. If anything, it made me more aware of the cost of leaving it. Who was I if I stopped being the reliable one? What leverage did I have if my usefulness was my primary currency? These questions stayed with me. They followed me into conversations, into quiet moments, into the pauses between decisions. I began to realize that as long as I remained in this role, my needs would always be secondary, not because anyone intended them to be, but because the system didn't require them to be addressed. The role worked. For everyone else. For me, it was slowly erasing something I hadn't yet learned how to protect. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't announce a change. But internally, a boundary began to form. Not a line I drew outward, but a recognition I held inward. I understood now what I had been to them. And once you understand that, you have to decide whether you're willing to remain it. The day something shifted didn't look important from the outside. No argument, no tears, no dramatic declaration. If you had asked anyone else what happened that day, they probably wouldn't remember it at all. I remember it clearly. It was a late afternoon, the kind where the light turns soft before disappearing entirely. I had just finished work and was sitting in my car, engine off, keys still in my hand. I wasn't in a rush to go inside. I needed a few minutes of stillness before stepping back into roles and expectations. My phone buzzed. A message from the family group chat. Short, practical. Someone needed help. Again, a plan had fallen apart. Someone else couldn't manage. The message wasn't addressed to me directly, but I knew what it meant. I was the solution being implied. I stared at the screen, waiting for the familiar instinct to kick in. The reflexive yes. The automatic adjustment of my evening. The mental reshuffling of priorities. It didn't come. Instead, there was a pause. Not resistance. Clarity. For the first time, I noticed how tired I was of being predictable. How my availability had become a resource that others accessed without checking its cost. How my life existed in a constant state of readiness, just in case someone else needed it. I didn't feel angry. I felt awake. I imagined what would happen if I didn't respond right away. Not forever, just not immediately. The thought didn't feel rebellious. It felt reasonable. So I set the phone down. I went inside. I made dinner. I took a shower. I did ordinary things at an unhurried pace. The world didn't collapse. No emergencies followed. No one called to check if I was okay. Later that evening, I picked the phone back up. The situation had resolved itself. Someone else had stepped in. Plans had adjusted. Life had moved on without me. That realization landed quietly but firmly. They didn't need me. They were just used to me. That distinction changed everything. It wasn't painful. It was freeing. Because if my presence wasn't essential, then my absence wasn't catastrophic, which meant I had more choice than I'd ever allowed myself to see. That night, I opened my notebook and wrote another sentence. Slower this time, more deliberate. Silence is also a response. I wasn't making a plan. I wasn't setting boundaries yet. I was simply noticing my own agency for the first time in a long while. Over the next few weeks, I practiced small delays. I didn't announce them. I didn't justify them. I just stopped responding immediately. I let myself consider whether I wanted to be involved, rather than assuming I would be. Nothing dramatic happened. No one accused me of changing. But something subtle shifted in how people spoke to me. Requests became slightly more specific. Assumptions became less automatic. I realized how much of my role had been maintained by my speed. Speed had signaled willingness. Silence had signaled uncertainty. And uncertainty, I learned, forces people to reassess. This wasn't about punishing anyone. It was about reclaiming a part of myself I had handed over gradually, without noticing. My time, my attention, my energy. I didn't feel empowered in the cinematic sense. There was no rush of confidence, just a steady, grounded awareness that I didn't have to perform reliability to be worthy of consideration. The shift wasn't visible yet, but it was real. And once it happened, there was no going back. At first, my silence was tentative. I treated it like something fragile, something I might have to explain or defend. But as time passed, it stopped feeling like absence and started feeling like intention. I wasn't ignoring anyone. I was listening to myself. When messages came in, I read them carefully. I noticed the language, who was asking and who was assuming, what was being requested and what was being offloaded. I began to distinguish between genuine need and habitual convenience. And then I chose. Sometimes I responded. Sometimes I didn't. Sometimes I said yes. Sometimes I said I'd think about it. Each response was slower, more deliberate. I let go of the need to be immediate, and in doing so, I reclaimed something I hadn't realized I'd lost: authorship over my own time. From the outside, it didn't look like growth. It looked like withdrawal. People filled in the gaps themselves. A few assumed I was busy. Others assumed I was tired. Some, I suspect, assumed I was being passive or disengaged. No one assumed I was being intentional. That was fine. Silence is often misread as weakness, as indecision, due to a lack of confidence. I knew that because I had once believed the same thing about myself. But silence, when chosen, is not empty. It's observant. I started noticing who followed up and who didn't, who respected delays and who grew impatient, who reframed requests as questions, and who doubled down with pressure. These patterns revealed more than any confrontation ever could. In conversations, I spoke less, but when I did, I was precise. I stopped cushioning statements with explanations. I didn't volunteer emotional labor unless it was asked for directly. I let pauses stretch. I allowed discomfort to exist without rushing to resolve it. The effect was subtle but unmistakable. People began to adjust. Not all of them. Some continued as before, pushing gently, assuming I'd fold. Others recalibrated, unsure of where I stood now that I wasn't signaling availability by default. There was a moment when my sister said, half joking, "You've been quiet lately." The comment was light, but it carried curiosity and something else, a faint uncertainty. I smiled and said, "I've been busy." It wasn't a lie. I was busy paying attention. Internally, I was preparing, not for revenge, for independence. I began reviewing old documents, financial arrangements, and shared responsibilities. I noticed how often I had taken on tasks informally, without acknowledgement or structure. I started formalizing my own records, not because I planned to leave, but because I wanted to know where I stood. I read, I learned, I asked questions quietly outside the family system. I gathered information the way I had once gathered everyone else's needs. No one noticed. Why would they? I was still calm, still polite, still helpful, just less predictably so. There's a particular kind of power in being underestimated while becoming more capable. People don't brace themselves. They don't defend. They don't prepare. They assume the system will hold. And for a while, it did. My silence wasn't dramatic enough to provoke concern. It was just different enough to create ambiguity. And ambiguity, unlike conflict, doesn't trigger an immediate response. It creates space. In that space, I began to see clearly. I saw how my family functioned without me stepping in instantly. I saw who took initiative when I didn't. I saw what was truly essential and what had simply been convenient. Most importantly, I saw myself not as a role, but as a person with choices. I didn't announce a transformation. I didn't demand recognition. I didn't need to. The shift was already underway. And the more my silence was mistaken for weakness, the more freedom it gave me to move without interference. What they never noticed was how much I had always been watching. Long before I chose silence, I had been observant by nature. I remembered details. I tracked patterns. I noticed what made people anxious and what made them careless. But before, that awareness had been used in the service of harmony, anticipating needs, preventing problems, smoothing outcomes. Now I repurposed it. While everyone assumed nothing had changed, I began preparing in ways that didn't require permission or announcement, quietly, methodically, with the same reliability I'd always shown. Only this time, it was directed inward. I started by documenting everything, not out of paranoia, but out of clarity. Responsibilities I'd absorbed over the years without formal acknowledgement. Financial contributions that had never been written down because we're family. Agreements that existed only in memory, always flexible, always in everyone else's favor. I wasn't looking for leverage yet. I was looking for the truth. In the margins of my notebook, I created timelines. Who asked for what? When? How often? I noted patterns in emergencies. How frequently I was contacted last, and how often my response was treated as guaranteed. I began to see just how much invisible infrastructure I had been maintaining. And like all infrastructure, it was only noticed when it stopped working. I also began learning in ways that surprised even me. I read about boundaries, not the motivational kind, but the structural kind. How systems shift when one person changes their position. How roles collapse when they're no longer reinforced. I studied finances, not because I was reckless before, but because I'd been trusting. I wanted to understand exactly where my security began and ended. What was shared, what was assumed, what was never actually agreed upon. Each discovery brought a quiet sense of grounding, not fear, not anger, just orientation. I realized how often I'd taken on risk without authority, responsibility without recognition, obligation without protection. None of it malicious, just inherited through habit. At the same time, I repositioned myself emotionally. I stopped offering unsolicited support. I listened without fixing. I let people experience the full weight of their own decisions. When something went wrong, I resisted the urge to step in automatically. I waited to be asked, clearly, directly. Often the request never came, and when it did, it was different, more cautious, less assumed. I noticed how quickly people adapted when they had to, how capable they were when the safety net wasn't instantly available. It made me question how much of my necessity had been real and how much had been learned dependence. There was a strange peace in that realization. I also began investing more deeply in my own life. Not in flashy ways, in quiet, stabilizing ones. I strengthened friendships that had always respected my time. I pursued interests I'd sidelined because they didn't serve anyone else's needs. For the first time, my energy wasn't being rationed around other people's priorities. It was being directed toward my own resilience. No one noticed this either. They still saw the same person. Calm, polite, present. They didn't see the internal shift. The way I was no longer emotionally tethered to outcomes I didn't control. There's a particular advantage in being underestimated during a period of preparation. People don't interfere. They don't question. They don't try to stop you because they don't know anything is happening. I wasn't hiding. I just wasn't explaining. Every system has pressure points, not weaknesses, dependencies. Places where one person's quiet labor keeps everything balanced. I had been one of those pressure points for a long time. Now, I was learning what would happen if I stepped slightly to the side. The preparation wasn't dramatic. There were no secret meetings or sudden decisions, just consistent, intentional positioning, making sure I knew my options before I needed them, making sure my stability didn't rely on anyone else's approval. By the time they began to sense something had changed, it was already too late to intervene. Because preparation, when done quietly, doesn't announce itself, it simply waits. The reveal didn't come from a confrontation or a confession. No one handed me information. No secret was exposed in a dramatic way. It arrived slowly through accumulation, one fact aligning with another until a larger picture became impossible to ignore. What I discovered wasn't a weapon. It was leverage born of imbalance. As I reviewed years of arrangements, financial, logistical, emotional, I realized how much of the family's stability had quietly depended on me. Not just in emergencies, but in everyday continuity. I had been the one filling gaps so consistently that the gaps themselves had disappeared from awareness. The leverage wasn't power over anyone. It was power away from the system. I saw how many things functioned because I was there to catch them. Accounts that stayed organized because I monitored them. Responsibilities that stayed invisible because I absorbed them. Conflicts that never escalated because I smoothed them before they reached the surface. None of this had been assigned. It had simply accumulated around my willingness. The clarity came one evening as I sat at my desk, papers spread out, notebook open. I wasn't searching for anything specific anymore. I was just reviewing what I now understood. If I stepped back, not dramatically, not angrily, but completely, things would not collapse. But they would strain. Timelines would stretch. Decisions would slow. People would notice the weight they had never carried themselves, and they wouldn't know why. That was the moment I understood the difference between being appreciated and being relied upon. Appreciation can be replaced. Reliance creates consequences. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt sober, because leverage, once recognized, comes with responsibility. The responsibility is not to misuse it, not to turn clarity into cruelty, not to become what had quietly diminished me. I didn't want revenge. I wanted alignment. The reveal also forced me to confront something uncomfortable. I had been complicit in my own positioning. By never asking for recognition, I had made my contributions easier to overlook. By never setting limits, I had blurred the line between help and expectation. The leverage wasn't something I could announce without destroying its value. If I told them what I'd discovered, it would become a negotiation, a plea, a debate. I didn't want any of that. I wanted my actions to speak in the only language the system understood. Absence, not abandonment. Absence of automatic repair. I sat with the knowledge for weeks. I didn't rush into anything. I watched how often my involvement was assumed, even as my responses slowed. I observed how fragile certain routines were without my constant reinforcement. No one thanked me for the past. No one acknowledged the present shift. They simply adapted, temporarily, imperfectly, assuming I would eventually resume my place. They were wrong. The private reveal wasn't about what I could take away, it was about what I could reclaim. Time, autonomy, dignity. I began planning, not an exit, but a reconfiguration, a way of living where my stability didn't depend on being needed, where my worth wasn't measured by my usefulness in crisis. There was grief in that planning, not for what I would lose, but for what I had never been offered. The choice to be first. The invitation was to be considered before adjustments were made. I allowed myself to feel that grief without dramatizing it, without turning it into an accusation. It passed through me like weather, acknowledged, then released. By the time the reveal settled into certainty, I was calm. I knew what I had. I knew what it meant. And most importantly, I knew I didn't have to explain it to anyone. Because leverage doesn't require permission, it only requires clarity. Once you see clearly, you can't pretend you don't. That was the quiet truth waiting for me at the decision point. I had leverage, yes, but more than that, I had awareness. And awareness demands a response, even if that response is restrained. For a while, I considered all the options. I could have confronted them, laid everything out calmly, logically, explained how much I had been carrying, how often I had been overlooked, how the role I'd been assigned no longer fit. I imagined the conversation in my head, me measured and articulate, they surprised but receptive. It was tempting. I could also have continued exactly as before, armed now with knowledge, knowing when to say no, knowing where my boundaries were even if they remained unspoken. That path would have been quieter, safer. Nothing would change on the surface, and I would retain my position without risk. But that option came with a cost I was no longer willing to pay, because staying, even with awareness, would mean accepting a system that only worked when I diminished myself. It would mean constantly negotiating my presence, measuring my silence, and moderating my availability. It would mean remaining the backup plan, just a more self-aware one. There was a third option, the one I avoided thinking about because it felt too final. To step away, not emotionally, but structurally. To remove myself from the positions that made me indispensable without making me visible. To choose absence, not as protest, but as alignment. This option was irreversible. Once taken, there would be no easy return to how things had been. No sliding back into the familiar role. No unspoken expectation that I would step in if things went wrong. I sat with that reality longer than with any other. Irreversibility has a weight to it. It forces you to ask whether you're ready to be misunderstood, whether you can tolerate silence where reassurance once lived, whether you're willing to be remembered differently or not at all. What finally decided it for me wasn't anger. It was fatigue. I was tired of being the contingency, tired of being calm so others could stay reactive, tired of being valued for what I prevented rather than who I was. I realized that if I didn't choose differently, I would spend the rest of my life making myself smaller to keep systems comfortable. So I chose the irreversible option. Not abruptly, not dramatically. I didn't announce anything. I simply began withdrawing from the structures that depended on my unpaid, unacknowledged labor. I handed off responsibilities methodically. I formalized what could be formalized. I stepped back, where stepping back was long overdue. Each action on its own was reasonable. Together, they marked a departure. I didn't ask for approval. I didn't seek validation. I didn't explain myself beyond what was necessary. Explanations invite debate, and I wasn't interested in negotiating my autonomy. The decision didn't feel powerful in the moment. It felt quiet, almost mundane. But beneath that calm was something solid. Commitment, once made, it held. I knew there would be consequences. confusion, frustration, maybe even resentment. But those reactions would belong to others. I had already carried enough that wasn't mine. This wasn't a rejection of my family. It was a refusal to remain misaligned within it. The decision point passed without ceremony. No one noticed when I crossed it, but I did, and that was enough. Once the decision was made, I didn't feel the urge to rush. Urgency had never served me well. It had only made me available. So I moved the way I always had, quietly, carefully, without drawing attention. The difference was intention. I began untangling myself from systems I'd been woven into for years. Not emotionally first, practically. That was where my real influence had always lived. There were shared responsibilities I'd taken on informally, bills I monitored just to help. I handled the paperwork because no one else liked dealing with it. I didn't confront anyone about these things. I simply stopped assuming ownership. I asked clarifying questions instead of fixing problems. Who's responsible for this now? Has anyone confirmed that? Do we have that in writing? Each question was neutral, reasonable, impossible to argue with. People answered casually at first, not sensing the shift. They filled in details without realizing they were stepping into spaces I'd once occupied by default. I watched carefully, not to judge, but to ensure the transfer was complete. Financially, I became precise. I separated what was shared from what was assumed. I documented contributions that had once been blurred by trust. I ensured my own accounts, savings, and obligations were fully independent. Clean lines, no ambiguity. This wasn't about distrust. It was about visibility. When everything is clear, nothing can be quietly taken for granted. I consulted professionals discreetly, asked questions I'd never thought to ask before, learned what I was entitled to, what I wasn't, and where my responsibilities truly ended. Each answer tightened the foundation beneath me. No one noticed because nothing appeared wrong. From the outside, I was still present, still polite, still calm. I attended family events. I responded when spoken to. I didn't withdraw emotionally. I withdrew structurally. That distinction mattered. Emotion draws attention. Structure doesn't. I also began saying no in ways that sounded like yes. Yes, I can help, after you've checked with everyone else. Yes, once there's a clear plan. Yes, if it's scheduled in advance. These conditions weren't new. They had always existed. I'd just never enforced them. Now I let them stand. Some requests dissolved on their own when they required effort from someone else. Others were redirected. A few lingered awkwardly, waiting for the old me to step in and smooth things out. I didn't. At work, the same pattern applied. I stopped volunteering for invisible labor. I documented my contributions. I clarified roles. The result wasn't conflict. It was recognition. Not praise, but acknowledgement. That was enough. The most interesting part of moving in silence is watching how people behave when they sense change but can't locate it. There was a slight increase in checking in, a few vague comments about how I'd been less available lately. Nothing accusatory, just observational. I nodded. I smiled. I let the comments pass, because availability had never been my obligation. Internally, I felt steadier than I ever had. Not empowered in a dramatic way, anchored. My time belonged to me. My energy was no longer pre-spent on emergencies that weren't truly mine. And still, no one sounded an alarm. Systems don't panic until strain becomes visible. And I was careful not to create visible strain, only sustainable boundaries. By the time anyone realized something essential had changed, the change was already integrated into my life. It didn't require maintenance. It didn't depend on mood or resolve. It simply was. Silence had carried me this far, and it was about to reveal its final effect. The consequences didn't arrive in a single moment. They unfolded gradually, like a system losing pressure, one quiet leak at a time. At first, it showed up as confusion. Someone forgot something that had never been forgotten before. A task went unfinished. A detail slipped through the cracks. Nothing catastrophic, just enough to cause mild inconvenience. The kind that usually never surfaced because I had always absorbed it before it became visible. People reacted with surprise, not blame. Huh, that's strange. I thought this was already handled. Didn't Hannah usually take care of this? The way my name entered those conversations was telling, not with accusation, with an assumption. They still believed I was part of the machinery. They just couldn't figure out why the machine wasn't running as smoothly. I watched from a distance, not physically absent, but functionally removed. I didn't correct misunderstandings unless asked directly. I didn't step in to repair delays that weren't assigned to me. I let natural consequences take their place. What followed wasn't anger, it was disorientation. People began double-checking things they'd never had to before. Conversations stretched longer. Decisions slowed. Small tensions surfaced where ease had once existed. No one knew exactly what had changed, only that something felt heavier. That's the strange thing about invisible labor. When it disappears, what's left isn't a clear absence. It's friction. I noticed subtle shifts in tone. Requests became more tentative, messages more detailed. There was an increase in just checking and making sure language. The system was recalibrating without understanding why. Still, no one asked me outright. They asked around me. They asked each other. They retraced steps. They tried to recreate routines that had once run smoothly without effort. And in doing so, they began to feel the weight I had been carrying quietly for years. There was a moment that stayed with me. A family member sighed, clearly frustrated, and said, "This all feels more complicated than it used to." I nodded sympathetically. It was more complicated. It always had been. The difference was that the complexity was no longer hidden inside me. What struck me most was how quickly irritation turned inward. No one accused me of withdrawing. Instead, they questioned themselves, their planning, their communication, their assumptions. Because from their perspective, I hadn't done anything. I was still there, still kind, still responsive, just not automatically corrective. That's when I understood something important. When you stop overfunctioning, people don't immediately miss you. They miss the ease you provided, and ease, once taken for granted, is hard to name when it's gone. There were a few moments of quiet resentment, small comments, mild defensiveness, nothing overt, just enough to reveal discomfort. But discomfort isn't injustice, it's an adjustment. I didn't feel guilty. I felt clear. Because I wasn't withholding support out of spite, I was simply no longer offering it preemptively. I was allowing responsibilities to land where they belonged. The consequences continued to accumulate, not dramatically, just consistently. And with each small disruption, the old narrative that I was merely easygoing, flexible, naturally supportive began to crack. They were beginning to feel the difference between presence and contribution. Still, no one confronted me. Not yet. The shift from confusion to panic was subtle, but unmistakable. At first, they believed the discomfort was temporary. A bad week, a miscommunication. Someone is dropping the ball. These things happen after all. Systems wobble sometimes before righting themselves. But this wobble didn't correct. Instead, the same problems kept reappearing in different forms. Tasks were missed. Deadlines slipped. Small conflicts escalated because there was no one quietly absorbing the tension before it surfaced. What used to feel seamless now required effort, coordination, and, most unsettling of all, accountability. That's when the questions began, not directly to me at first. Around me. Did we change how we do this? Wasn't there a system for this before? Why does this feel harder than it used to? I heard my name mentioned more frequently, often followed by pauses. Not accusations, hesitations. as if they were circling a realization they weren't quite ready to articulate. Eventually, someone asked me outright, "Hey, have you been handling this lately, or am I misremembering?" The question was gentle, almost casual, but it carried something beneath it, a hope that I would say yes, that the old order could be restored without effort or acknowledgement. I answered calmly, "No, that hasn't been my responsibility for a while." The silence that followed was brief but dense. "Oh," they said, "I didn't realize." That phrase appeared again and again in different conversations. "I didn't realize you were doing all that. I didn't realize you'd stepped back. I didn't realize how much you handled." Realization came late, and late realizations rarely feel like relief. They feel like loss. There was a period where people tried to patch things together, to recreate old routines without fully understanding them, to redistribute responsibilities without truly owning them. It created tension, frustration, occasional sharpness that had never been directed at me before, but wasn't quite directed at anyone else either. They were looking for the missing piece. By then, it was too late to put me back where I'd been, because the role no longer existed. I hadn't just stepped out of it, I'd dissolved it. Carefully, completely, without ceremony. There were attempts to negotiate, not formal ones, emotional ones. Comments like, "We've always relied on you," delivered with a nostalgic tone, or, "You're just better at this stuff," said as if talent were an obligation, or, "Things were easier when you handled it," framed as an observation rather than a request. I listened. I nodded. I didn't argue, because explaining would have invited debate, and debate would have implied reversibility. What they were really feeling wasn't anger, it was regret. The slow understanding that something valuable had been taken for granted until it was no longer available. And regret, unlike frustration, doesn't motivate change quickly. It lingers. It circles. It looks backward instead of forward. Some of them tried to compensate with appreciation, thanking me for things long past, acknowledging contributions that were no longer being made. I accepted the words graciously, but they landed differently than they once would have. Gratitude after the fact doesn't restore trust. It only confirms its absence. I could see the realization forming, that I hadn't left emotionally, but I had become unreachable in the way that mattered most. Not distant, independent. They couldn't ask me to return to the role without admitting how much it had cost me. And that admission required a level of self-reflection they weren't prepared for. So the system adjusted without me, clumsily, imperfectly, permanently. And I stayed where I was, calm, present, no longer positioned to catch what fell. Because some fixes only exist before clarity arrives. After that, all you can do is adapt. An adaptation, I had learned, belongs to everyone, not just the most reliable one. The confrontation, when it finally happened, didn't feel like a confrontation at all. There was no raised voice, no listing of grievances, no moment where years of restraint spilled over into something unrecognizable. It was quiet, almost restrained, like a conversation that had waited so long it no longer needed intensity to be heard. It happened in a familiar setting, a place where countless other conversations had taken place, without consequence. Someone asked if we could talk. The tone was careful, as if they already sensed the ground had shifted. We sat across from each other. I noticed how different the energy felt now that I wasn't bracing myself to explain, defend, or smooth anything over. They spoke first, not with accusation, but with confusion. They said they felt something had changed, that I seemed more distant, less involved. They asked if they had done something wrong. I listened without interrupting, without preparing a response in my head. When they finished, there was a pause, longer than the ones I used to rush through. Then I spoke. I didn't recount history. I didn't catalog moments of dismissal. I didn't explain how long I'd felt invisible. None of that would have helped. It would have turned the conversation into a courtroom. And I wasn't there to argue a case. I said something simpler. I realized I was taking responsibility for things that weren't actually mine, and I stopped. That was it. They looked surprised, not offended, but unsettled, as if they'd expected something more emotional, something they could respond to with reassurance or apology. They asked why I hadn't said anything sooner. I told them the truth, because I didn't fully understand it myself until recently. That answer seemed to land harder than any accusation would have. There was another pause. Then they said they hadn't meant for me to feel that way, that they appreciated me, that they'd always trusted me. I nodded. I didn't disagree. I know, I said, and I believe you. What I didn't say but didn't need to was that trust without consideration isn't the same as respect. They asked if I was upset, if I wanted things to go back to how they were. That was the moment where the old version of me might have softened, might have reassured, might have minimized. Instead, I stayed steady. I'm not upset, I said. And no, I don't want things to go back. Not said harshly, not said defensively, just stated. The conversation ended shortly after that, not because it was unresolved, but because there was nothing left to negotiate. I wasn't asking for change. I had already made it. As I left, I felt something unfamiliar. Not relief, not triumph. Finality. The confrontation hadn't been about being understood. It had been about being clear. And clarity, once expressed, doesn't require agreement. I didn't walk away feeling lighter because I'd spoken my truth. I walked away feeling grounded because I hadn't abandoned it to keep the peace. That was the quiet victory. No one clapped. No one apologized dramatically. No relationships exploded or healed overnight. But something fundamental had shifted. I was no longer explaining my boundaries. I was living them. After everything settled, I expected to feel different in obvious ways. Lighter, maybe, or sharper, or triumphant. Instead, what arrived was quieter than any of that. Stability. For the first time, my sense of self wasn't built around reaction. I wasn't measuring my worth by how quickly I could respond or how effectively I could prevent problems. My days felt less urgent, not because there were fewer responsibilities, but because they were finally mine. I'm still reliable. That part of me didn't disappear. But reliability is no longer my identity. It's a choice I make selectively. I offer it where there is mutual respect, where effort flows in both directions, and where presence is valued before crisis. With my family, things are different now. Not distant, just clearer. I'm no longer the default solution. When I show up, it's intentional. When I help, it's requested, acknowledged, and bound. There's less ease, but more honesty. Less assumption, more communication. Some people adjusted quickly, others more slowly. A few never fully did. I learned to accept that without taking it personally, because identity shifts often feel like a loss to those who benefited from the old version. I don't carry resentment. That surprised me. I thought there might be anger waiting on the other side of clarity, but there wasn't. Just understanding. Understanding that no one wakes up intending to overlook someone they love. Roles form through repetition, through convenience, through silence. I had been silent for a long time. What changed wasn't my family. It was my relationship with myself. I learned that being easy is not the same as being kind. That adaptability, when unbounded, becomes erasure. That love doesn't require self-disappearance to be real. I also learned something humbling. I had been afraid of my own weight, afraid that if I took up space, something would break. But nothing did. The world expanded just enough to hold me. Now, when I'm quiet, it's not because I'm withholding. It's because I'm listening. When I speak, it's not to smooth tension. It's to be accurate. When I step in, it's because I choose to, not because I'm expected to. I keep the notebook still, not because I need it as armor, but because it reminds me who I was when I didn't know I had options. It grounds me. If I'm remembered now, it's not only when others fail, Sometimes I'm remembered because I matter, and when I'm not, I don't interpret it as absence. I interpret it as freedom. The quiet dominance people talk about isn't about control. It's about authorship, about deciding where your energy goes without needing permission or applause. That's who I am now, not the backup plan, not the safety net, not the one who can always wait. Just a person who knows her place and chose it herself. For a long time, I believed being chosen meant being needed, that if people relied on me, it was proof of love. I mistook usefulness for belonging and silence for maturity. It took years to understand how quietly those beliefs had shaped my life. The truth is simpler and harder. Being needed is not the same as being valued. Being reliable is not the same as being respected. And being remembered only when others fail is not a role you're required to accept. This story doesn't end with anyone losing everything. No bridges were burned. No dramatic exits were staged. What ended was an arrangement that no longer honored who I had become. Quiet dominance isn't about winning. It's about refusing to lose yourself slowly. If there's a moral here, it's this. When you make yourself endlessly adjustable, people will stop adjusting for you. Not out of cruelty, but out of habit. The most dangerous roles aren't the ones assigned loudly. They're the ones we slip into because they feel safe, familiar, and unchallenging. Roles that reward silence and punish presence. Roles that praise you for being easy while slowly teaching you to disappear. Change doesn't always require confrontation. Sometimes it requires consistency. Sometimes it requires letting the system feel what you've been carrying alone. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stop explaining. If you're listening to this and recognizing yourself in any part of it, know this: awareness is already movement. You don't have to act immediately. You don't have to burn anything down. You only have to notice where you've been overfunctioning and ask whether it still serves you. You are allowed to be more than the backup plan. You are allowed to be considered before things fall apart. You are allowed to let silence work on your behalf. I didn't reclaim my life by becoming louder or harsher. I reclaimed it by becoming deliberate. And that choice, quiet, steady, irreversible, changed everything. Before we end, I want to ask you something, and I'd genuinely like to hear your answer in the comments. Have you ever realized you were only valued when things went wrong? And what did you do once you noticed? Thank you for listening.